So hello, we're back in another show about this incredible radio show which is Culture Shock. This week we're going to talk about culture, cognition and change, which is really special because this week we have Dr. Zachary Brooks, who is having the conferences all this week here, so please.
Hi, yes, I am Zachary Brooks, and you can call me Dr. Zachary Brooks, or I prefer to call myself Dr. Z. If you're in the other parts of the English-speaking world, you can say Dr. Z. So, yeah.
So he is this very special guest, and as always, our hosts
Fernanda,
Nathaniel,
and Vic. So we're going to listen to the Vox Populi, and we're coming back in a few minutes.
bueno, yo creo que a través de la comunicación con nuestros padres, con nuestra familia en sí, o sea, con las personas que nos rodeaban cuando éramos chiquitos, y pues se va transmitiendo, es algo que se va aprendiendo, porque tú lo ves, lo estás escuchando, ves cómo las personas mueven la boca, entonces es una forma de aprendizaje, o sea, a través de la como repetición.
¿Y tú crees que los animales tienen una lengua como nosotros o simplemente son animales?
No, pues sí tienen una forma de comunicación, depende de la especie obviamente, y pues, pero sí tienen, yo sí creo que tengan una forma de cómo se comuniquen, pero pues sí es como una característica propia de la especie.
Bueno, ¿y tú cómo te imaginas que nosotros aprendimos a hablar cuando estábamos pequeños?
Por imitación y al escuchar a nuestros padres, al repetir lo que ellos decían, al escuchar y ya nosotros lo decíamos.
¿Y tú crees que los animales tienen una lengua como nosotros o simplemente son animales y no se comunican?
Yo creo que sí tienen lengua, bueno, no lengua como tal, pero sí como comunicación cierto grado.
¿Y tú crees que nosotros ya estamos predispuestos a aprender la lengua o es algo natural?
Creo que es algo natural.
¿Y tú cómo te imaginas que nosotros aprendimos a hablar español cuando estábamos pequeños?
Pues yo creo que aprendimos gracias a nuestros papás y como las técnicas que nos fueron como fomentando con la misma práctica del habla, siendo que pues así aprendimos.
¿Y tú crees que estamos predispuestos, o sea, tenemos un chip de aprender la lengua o simplemente es algo natural?
Yo creo que es algo natural porque pues, o sea, tanto podemos aprender, siento que en un lapso muy corto, como tanto, no sé, lenguas diferentes, tanto el español como el inglés, entonces siento que es como algo pues natural.
¿Y tú crees que los animales tienen una lengua como nosotros o no se comunican?
Yo creo que sí, porque pues de alguna manera pues como que no sea tanto como nosotros que literalmente pues hablamos así, sino que tienen como algunos rasgos o algunas prácticas que pues saben que no sé, que algún animal está diciendo, no, pues aquí hay comida o aquí hay peligro o algo así, o sea, no tal cual como nosotros, pero sí, creo que sí.
Bueno, ¿y tú cómo crees que aprendimos a hablar español cuando estábamos pequeños?
Pues yo creo que fue con base a lo que nuestros padres nos enseñaban, en el sentido de lo que escuchábamos de ellos, lo que veíamos en el exterior, las personas, nuestra familia, nuestros amigos, nuestros maestros en el kinder. No, y también con las herramientas que nos daban nuestros padres, ¿no? Ciertos libros o ciertas actividades o dinámicas que nos hacían hacer de niños.
¿Y tú crees que los animales tienen una lengua así como nosotros o no se comunican?
Digo que sí se comunican, no tienen una lengua en específico, pero sí tienen un sistema de comunicación intuitiva, ¿no? Ya que pues no tienen una forma de razonar, ¿no? Más que nada actúan con intuición y con una pequeña comunicación, como dije, intuitiva.
Ok, muchísimas gracias. ¿Y tú cómo crees que nosotros aprendimos?
So that's what our community thinks about language and culture. So now, please, before talking about these topics, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So again, Zachary Brooks. I have a doctorate from the University of Arizona. I graduated from the College of Science and the College of Humanities. The actual degree is called Second Language Acquisition and Teaching, and my research is in bilingual decision making. If you want to know more, I can talk more, but before I was a B-level Hollywood actor, I worked in Silicon Valley. I've traveled quite a bit as well, so I'm not just an academic. So I'm not sure if there's other questions that come later that you want me to go in more depth, or if that's enough for now.
It's to know, why are you here in Mexico?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll just walk back around 3 months, 2.5 months. So in August of this year, 2018, I was in Utah, another state in the United States. I live in Arizona, or I was living in Arizona. I'm not sure what my identity is right now. And my friend was looking after my apartment, just to make sure the plants were okay. And she texted me one day and she said, "Hey, I have a friend from Mexico. He got accepted to University of Arizona. Is it okay if he stays at your place?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." Well, after like a couple days, his name's Mario. He's from Cholula. He said, what are you going to be doing now? Because I'm going to be staying in your place. You don't have an apartment. I said, "Yeah, that's true. I don't have a place to live. I don't know what I'm going to do." He said, "Well, do you want to live in Mexico?" I said, "Well, sure." And after like 2 hours, he said, "I have an apartment for you in Cholula with my friend, Avi." And so then I came to Cholula, and then I met people at UPAEP, and now I'm here in Mexico. But the last 2 years, I've spent about 4 or 5 months in Mexico, every place from Chihuahua to Chiapas. So I'm in Mexico often, and Tucson, Arizona is only 1 hour from Sonora, so I can go to Mexico in 1 hour when I live in Tucson. So.
And of all the different places in Mexico you've visited, what sticks out, and what do you like about being in Puebla or Cholula?
Yeah, I mean, Puebla sticks out because this is probably my longest stay, and I'm starting to feel really comfortable here. I feel like I'm developing a life here. But what sticks out in Mexico is the food. In every place you go to, generally speaking, Mexicans are extremely friendly wherever you go in Mexico, and I've never had any problems in Mexico. As you know, in the United States, sometimes you hear the news stories about how dangerous it is, and then I come here, and I'm very trusting. I never have any problems ever in Mexico, so I find Mexico very safe, great food, the people are wonderful, and then the education institutions, because I've been here many times for talks, are really high end. I mean, there's incredible students here. I mean, some of the best students in the world I've ever met are here in Mexico, so it's just a wonderful experience to be here.
And so, I mean, to sort of maybe serve as a segue from some of your background and into our topic for today.
Sure.
How do you feel about your Spanish? Is your living in Mexico? You've traveled here quite a bit, and also what other languages do you speak? And to maybe use that to discuss a little bit more about language acquisition in your personal context before we get into some of the details of the subject.
Sure. Bueno, he estado hablando el español desde muchos años. Viví en España, trabajé como barman norte de Barcelona, en el país de Cataluña, la región, por supuesto. Y en Arizona, Los Ángeles, otros lugares hay mucho español, entonces me siento bien que puedo defenderme por lo menos en esta lengua que me encanta. I also speak German. I studied in Germany. I do speak Portuguese at pretty high levels, although I haven't really used it for a while. And then I like to do accents because I was an actor in Hollywood, so I had to learn a lot of accents. As far as language acquisition, I really think for me this is not an academic thing. It's always about seeing the world through someone else's eyes. So what would it be like to be you for a day? You know, what would it be like to be you for a day? And that's like an actor's kind of point of view, but also for me, it's a language learner's point of view. If I were this Mexican person in that person's eyes, what would I see? What would I think? What would I feel? How would I behave? And so that's always how I approach, just as a learner, language acquisition. What would it be like to be that person?
Well, you're going to be here in Mexico for a while, so
Yes.
so far have you experienced any type of culture shock?
Yeah, I have. You know, it's funny because the word in Spanish you guys have that's really good is desmadre. And, you know, compared to many gringos and Americans, I'm probably fairly comfortable. I'm very comfortable in Mexico. But because I'm American, maybe I'm an academic, I still have certain things I expect, like, oh, it's going to work this way, and then it doesn't. And so that's sometimes frustrating for me. And so I think that I have to adjust myself. On the other hand, Mexico is extremely functional and it has super high efficiency in Mexico. But there's little things like, I don't know, Uber drivers or something like that frustrate me and how that works. You know, they say they'll be in 5 minutes and it's 25 minutes later. And, you know, it's those kind of things. And those are the things that maybe I have the most culture shock with, is just how things work sometimes. But, you know, I'm here, everything's working fine, and I don't know, I'm very happy in Mexico. But yeah, I have culture shock. Even though I feel like I shouldn't because I study this, I still have a lot of culture shocks. I'm always a little bit embarrassed that I don't know better. So.
Well, it doesn't matter. You can study a lot, but the experience is the one that
The
actually
experience,
gives you the
yeah,
tools to.
that's absolutely right.
So, now first of all, we're going to talk about culture. So, there are a lot of theories, but what's culture for Dr. Zachary Brooks?
Yeah, someone said it the other day. I'll borrow what someone said. It's what you do and who you are. I forget who. Did you say this? Or?
No, Alicia.
Actually, the one that did the Vox Populi said that.
Yeah, that was the way she said it.
At your seminar.
Yeah, my seminar. Yeah, there was a student. What's her name? Do you happen to know?
Alice.
Alice. Yeah, she said it's who you are and what you do. And that's beautiful. It's a really beautiful definition of culture because it captures everything in a very simplistic way. But I think it's a very powerful way to think about it.
And so how does this idea of culture, and because it is a word that gets bandied about quite a bit, and so when we talk about a culture being, you know, a group of people and who they are and what they do, and so, but then we get into questions of intercultural relationships and intercultural competence for language learners, but also travelers and this sort of thing. And could you give us a little bit of insight into that and what these sorts of terms mean?
Yeah, so I'll start with something I talked about yesterday called the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. I think it's a pretty old model, 1988 or 1992 by Bennett and Bennett. And it has 6 stages, and the first 3 stages are ethnocentric, very much my culture is the best, and the next ones are more, I think it's called ethno-relative. I should know, but I'm pretty sure it's ethno-relative, where you kind of interact with cultures, and you go from this phase of denial, these cultural differences don't exist, to defense, like, well, mine is still better. You kind of accept cultures. Eventually, you sort of get to the next phases of acceptance and adaptation, and the final phase is integration. And so I think that's a nice way to think about intercultural competence, that there's different stages, and I don't think that the stages are one way. You can go from denial all the way to acceptance, but sometimes you step back a stage because maybe there's a new set of circumstances that are difficult, and it's hard for you, or maybe you have a really strong identity in one particular part of your personality and you can't move from that, and so you only stay at this acceptance phase but not integration. So I think intercultural competence, also as a study, I think it's sometimes extremely hard to study because you can just talk forever about it and you can think it's not real, but the second you go to a new country and you arrive in that new airport, all of these things become very, very real. The language, the culture, how you greet someone, what politeness means in another place. And so these things are extremely real for anyone who's traveled or anyone who attempts to speak a second language.
Okay, and before we go to a brief cut, what's perception?
Perception is a mental operation that your brain. So in visual cognition, there's sort of two concepts. I'll talk about it in this way: feed forward and feed back. So feed forward is that you start with electrochemical signals. They hit your eye, and eventually in the occipital lobe, the back of your brain will build up this image. So I'm going to look at a computer. I see lines, and eventually those lines develop to become a computer. But in the meantime, as I'm looking at this, my brain has seen a computer before, so it starts to form that image before the image is formed by the electrochemical chemicals. So perception is sort of two things. One, it's the building up of an image, but it's also the push down of an image of images you've seen before. So perception is very much a mental operation where you're trying to make sense of the world with the limitations of your brain.
Okay,
So we have some interesting and important terms here. We have perception, we have cultural, we have intercultural competence. And so what we're trying to understand is how all of these start to fit together. If culture is who we are and what we do, and perception is this process that you described, how can we sort of relate these to one another?
Well, that's kind of what I'm trying to do this week. I mean, I think the fact that UPAEP and the people here were smart enough to say, yeah, we want to do this week-long series with Dr. Z, that's me, starting with intercultural competence to brain and language, ending the week with adaptive leadership. I think that's what UPAEP is trying to do, is figure out how these connections are made. For me, all these connections are very obvious because I've studied them, but now I'm trying to make these connections more obvious to people who haven't. So if we understand the brain better, then we can certainly understand why we might perceive something a certain way, and that perception is many times culture. You know, if that culture is reality or not, that's a different question, but sometimes perception is reality. So if you perceive your grandmother's desires in a certain way, that is a very strong cultural thing, but it's just your perception that comes from your brain. So if you understand how the brain operates and how understands how that can operate on and with a particular cultural construct, then you can start to make these connections between just a behavior that you're using in your family or on the streets or something like that and your brain.
Okay, well, it looks like we're up on a break right
Beautiful.
now. But we will want to ask some more questions about these connections and how you see them.
Beautiful.
In just a minute.
Está de vuelta. No te pierdas todos los martes en punto de las 13 horas tu programa BIOS. Con nuevas secciones, entrevistas, enlaces telefónicos, transmisiones en vivo y mucho más. BIOS, el sonido de lo natural está de vuelta. No te lo pierdas todos los martes en punto de las 13 horas.
UPAEP, rumbo al 50 aniversario. Misión.
Crear corrientes de pensamiento y formar líderes que transformen a la sociedad, en la búsqueda de la verdad, integrando fe, ciencia y vida. Valores.
Junto a la verdad, el bien y la belleza, nuestra universidad sostiene como valores rectores la dignidad de la persona humana, la libertad, la solidaridad, la subsidiariedad, la congruencia, el respeto, el amor y la justicia.
Somos una comunidad universitaria fraterna, congruente, alegre y comprometida, que es referente en la conjunción del pensamiento humanista, cristiano y las ciencias, que forma integralmente líderes con alta calidad profesional y compromiso social. Contribuye a la transformación de la sociedad con propuestas pertinentes, orientadas a la consecución del bien común. Tiene presencia e influencia en los ámbitos local, regional, nacional e internacional. Centra la gestión en la persona y optimiza los recursos al servicio de la misión institucional. Líneas rectoras.
Atreverse a vivir congruentemente nuestra identidad, como ejemplo de virtud en el servicio, con respeto y amor al prójimo, para la transformación social en orden al bien común.
Privilegiar a través de la academia la formación humanista cristiana en busca de la excelencia científica y profesional, con pensamiento universal y trascendencia social.
Crear sistemas académicos de auténtica pertinencia social, a través de la docencia, investigación y extensión, para enriquecer la cultura y participar en la solución de los problemas fundamentales del país.
Involucrarse en la formación y desarrollo intercultural de la comunidad universitaria a través de ámbitos y vínculos de internacionalización.
Lograr ambientes de confianza, colaboración y servicio, dentro de una cultura de austeridad, transparencia y evaluación. UPAEP, rumbo al 50 aniversario.
Puebla, mi vida, mi universidad, mi espacio. Comienza mi historia. Octubre 2018. Soy UPAEP.
Hey, welcome back to Culture Shock, and we have here Dr. Zachary Brooks. And continue with our topic. Tell me, what is the relation between culture and our perception?
Well, I think easy examples for people, people in the group I'm with right now in the radio studio, they know because they study these things. But anyone who hasn't thought of these things before, I think two kind of ways to think about it would be color and then language itself. So a famous example that people talk about is Eskimos. So Eskimos are an indigenous tribe in the northern parts of North America, so northern Canada, Alaska, those places. And they have multiple words for white and snow and so forth because they deal with various colors of white and snow and so forth. That's an example that people use a lot. And, we in the United States speaking English or in Mexico speaking Spanish, we might only have one word or maybe just a couple words for the word white, white, blanco, and so forth. So that's one way that language and culture and the brain and perception interact very clearly. If you only have one word for a certain thing, you can perceive things. Maybe your eyes can actually see those different variants of color, but you only have one word that can apply like a label like to that particular phenomenon. So that's one way to think about how culture and perception interact. And the other one is about language itself. So if we were to suddenly start speaking Spanish, there would be limitations on us that we would put on us by the language, but we would also have much more freedom in other ways to speak about certain things because of the language. So one example is Spanish. Many people, when I drive with Uber drivers, they always ask me, bueno, ¿de dónde eres? Y ¿de dónde es usted? Y ya. They ask me things about myself. And they always, and not always, I would say half the time, they ask me, what's the hardest part about Spanish? And the hardest part about Spanish is the verbs in many ways because the conjugations are so complex and difficult. And so those sounds are physical, chemical instruments that drive on our perception of the world, and they create the world for us. If you're speaking Spanish with these verb conjugations, you have a very different perception of the world than you do with English with simply two verb conjugations. Walk, walks, in Spanish. Camino, caminas, camina, caminamos. In Spain, camináis, caminan, right? And that's a very different kind of thing. So I think those are two easy ways to think about how perception and culture and language interact is the language we use. Even if we, as humans, can perceive a variety of things, it's the language itself that categorizes the world in ways that we can express ourselves with more latitude or less latitude?
Talking about that, like fun facts, there are tribes in Africa that believe, because of their perceptual culture, that our green and our blue are the same color, but they have different words for dark red and light red. So that's also about
that's a great example.
colors. Also, one thing that I cannot imagine is that there's a tribe in the Amazon that do not use numbers at all, just one or many.
Yeah.
So I cannot imagine a life without numbers.
Yeah, exactly. That's the story.
And also, I once read something called systemic linguistic distortion, which I understood that it's how one word can have different connotations, so we can have different images about it. For example, if we say here in Mexico that someone is energetic, maybe, well, in Español, energético, we have the idea that he's someone happy and
interesting,
joyful, and who loves life and always smiling and stuff.
Yeah.
But maybe in English, energetic means that it's kind of aggressive. So even though it's the same word, there are different paths according to the language you speak.
No, I think you're right. The cognates are very good examples of language and perception.
One thing that this is reminding me of is, and I don't know if you can speak to this specifically, but there's a popular TED Talk in which, and I'm not the biggest fan of TED Talks personally, but it's been, several people have referenced it to me over the years, talking about, I mean, specifically the Romance languages with gender and the uses of gender. And so is that, I don't know if you're familiar with the TED Talk I'm mentioning about how...
Is this the bridge?
Yeah. And I was wondering if you could speak, I mean, I'm in no way a linguist and don't study language per se. I'm more on the, in the literature field. But is that something that you've come across in your research? And
I mean, I can only recount what you shared. I mean, the research in German, I think it was the German and French, started. So German has 3 articles: der, die, das. Der is masculine, die is feminine, and das is neutral. And the French has 2, le, la, so masculine and feminine. And then the bridges, either have a masculine form because of the language or a feminine form. And what comes from that, so this is sort of a psychological term like priming. So if you give someone a set of words or an expression, then they're more likely to later express something or think something or see something quicker because they're primed to see something or think something later. So in those particular studies, if you have a bridge that has a masculine article, then people are more likely to give masculine adjectives associated with that noun. The reverse is also true. If you have a bridge with a feminine article, people are more likely to give feminine adjectives associated with that bridge. Beauty would be one versus, strength or something like that. So that's kind of what that's applying to. So it's also a great example of how language, culture, perception interact.
And so that would I mean, some of our other notes here that you guys included. So that would connect back to perhaps the way that culture and not only connects with language and perception, but also with our own personality and identity.
Well, that's a really hard question.
Okay.
I mean, I call it the specter of individual differences. So when you get into, the world of humanities or social behavior sciences, people take science and social behavior sciences extremely seriously, as they should. And some of the frustration is social behavior sciences don't behave like natural sciences, such as physics or chemistry. In physics and chemistry, there can be one objective answers, and you get tendencies. But then the question often is asked, and it's a very valid question, is like, well, that's just an individual difference between people. And could you just expand that idea of just an individual difference between people who speak different languages? And so that one is a very, I think, hard question to answer scientifically, because there's so many confounds. I mean, different things that can explain the same phenomenon with the same set of facts, the same set of data, and things that I ran into a lot in my bilingual decision-making research, this thing about individual differences.
Also, not long time ago, you mentioned about intercultural relations. So, why do you think we need to coexist with other cultures?
I liked your question. How do you answer that exactly? I mean, I guess we could start with the opposite. We don't need to, right? I don't need to have a friend. I don't need to have a Mexican friend. I don't need to have a German friend. I don't need to have a Canadian friend. I don't need to have a friend who has a different skin tone. I don't need to have a female friend. Let's say you could live like that theoretically, but then you would say, well, why? Females are nice. And so is my friend from another part of the country. And my friend from Mexico is extremely nice too. And I like him because he brings something to my life that I don't have. Or my friend from Germany or so forth. So I think your question, like why need, some way we don't need these things. You could say that. But then why? And the world has become so interconnected. I know there's people in the United States right now and other parts of the world who like to say, well, we want to become more proud about our own country and more nationalistic, the rest of it. But honestly, I think the connections that we make right now in this moment with you guys and with our friends from around the world, you talked about this African thing. I don't think we want to go back once we make those connections because we like those connections and we value those connections and those connections become a part of our lives and who we are. So if we accept that we like the connections we're making and how this has become a part of our life, then we might as well be smart about it and get better. Just like, a relationship with someone, you want to get better at that relationship, to get to know that person. The same principles expand across the world. You want to get better. And intercultural competency and studying that is a way to get better at relationship building.
Okay, well, I've got a question about cross-cultural and intercultural relations. As there are some cultures that are way too different or maybe even the opposite to what we believe as a culture. So how can you solve this personality difference when you are meeting someone from a different culture? If for example, I'm giving a class and I like my students to keep eye contact, but they don't, how can you find this balance between both parts of the equation?
Oh, that's a good question. I read in a blog, but I've probably seen it before too. You guys might have seen the same thing about travelers who've traveled a lot of the world, more than you or I or anyone else in this room have traveled. And they say, it's fundamentally people want to be loved and respected. So I think, if you start with that point of view, then you can start building on that. As far as like your particular question, when I taught in the United States with a room full of Chinese students and a room of Arabic-speaking students, those are sort of like complete opposite groups as far as their student behavior. So for the people who don't know, so Chinese students and generally East Asian students tend to be much more quiet in the classroom. They won't ask questions because for them that's not good student behavior. For them, good student behavior is being quiet, listening intently, and taking notes. For someone from, let's say, the Gulf states, those students, for them, good student behavior is asking lots of questions, but interrupting the teacher all the time. But teacher, right, all the time. And so, United States, it's important to kind of do both of those. We kind of respect both of those ideas, but we want people to raise their hands, and then the teacher will call on people in turn. So John raised his hand first, Sarah raised her hand second, and so forth. So I think as a teacher, if we're talking about a teaching environment, I think you need to set the expectations up front. This is how we want to do it there. We respect, you raising your hand, and we respect you taking notes. And we know those are good behaviors in your country. So I think that's where intercultural competence can help. If you know those are the behaviors that are expected, and those behaviors are considered good behaviors in your country, if you know that already, then it can help them make the transition to a different behavior in a different country, especially in a classroom context.
Okay, well, I've got another example.
Yeah,
it is more, difficult, rough. For, let's say, I'm in another country where they are pretty individualistic people. So I get sick and I'm in the hospital. Obviously, as Mexican, I would love to have them visit and stay there with me and play and have a party in the dressing room.
Yeah.
But if they are like, okay, you're sick, I'm going to respect your space, I'm going to stay at home. So how can you... Obviously, I want attention because that's what my culture tells me, but they are not providing it. So how can you find the balance there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I know American hospitals, especially in the larger cities, like Philadelphia, Tucson, Arizona, where there's a lot of Spanish speakers and there's a lot of native tribes. There's 22 native tribes in the state of Arizona. So I think bigger cities in the United States, that probably wouldn't be as big a problem. The reason why is because a lot of the nurses and doctors there are very familiar with different customs. So they'll probably try to make some accommodations, because I've been in the hospital a couple times now in Tucson where you get Mexican families and they come, like 10 of them come to the room, right? And so it's obvious there that they're very comfortable with that, but then they have American families where like one come at a time. And so, those kind of places, I imagine Philadelphia, and I keep pointing to Philadelphia because one of the interviewers has lived there in Philadelphia most recently. These are very dynamic cities, so they have a lot of different cultures there. But, as far as that question, if you're not in a city like that, that's a really hard thing to deal with. This is where culture becomes extremely real and extremely painful. If you have an expectation that people are going to visit you in the hospital and they don't because they can't, then culture is very real and it's very painful, because the thing you grew up with expecting doesn't happen. That it's not just culture anymore, it's your physical body. You grew up with these expectations. So that's a very real thing. I don't know if there's an answer for that, but that's a nice example where culture is not just an academic conversation. It's something very physical.
We are coming up on a break, but we got the signal just a moment ago. So we have you seen? Can you, thinking about the time you've spent in Mexico, do you see any of these in particular? Oh, we are just up on a break, but when we get back from the break, have you? So Victor gave us some examples of him of traveling abroad and different experiences, and we're wondering, about your experiences here in Mexico, maybe helping you to better understand your own field and expand your thinking on it. But also, I think we'll probably want to get into some other questions about education and interculturality and some of the buzzwords that we hear these days, such as cultural appropriation and cultural assimilation and some of these big themes. So we will be back in just a moment with Radio Culture Shock.
Puebla, mi vida, mi universidad, mi espacio. Comienza mi historia. Octubre 2018. Soy UPAEP.
Vida de Estudiambre presenta un espacio cultural.
Pide al tiempo que vuelva. Es una película ubicada en 1980. Esta película nos demuestra que el tiempo es subjetivo mientras exista algo que nos acerque a la persona que queremos, y que una moneda tiene el poder de hacernos volver al pasado.
¿Te gustaría crear o mejorar dispositivos para el servicio de seres vivos, tales como prótesis, órtesis e instrumental biomédico? ¿Qué estás esperando? La Escuela de Ingeniería Biónica de la UPAEP te invita a conocer cómo un ingeniero biónico domina y aplica las habilidades de elementos mecánicos, electrónicos y biológicos en las personas. Conoce nuestro plan de estudios conformado por 9 cuatrimestres con líneas terminales en diseño y manufactura de prótesis, emprendedores e instrumentación biomédica, con un campo de trabajo que va desde el sector salud, automotriz y aeroespacial. Para más información, comunícate al teléfono 229-9400, extensión 7146, o consulta la página www.upaep.mx. Ingeniería biónica, calidad de vida en tus manos. Haz lo tuyo. Hazlo UPAEP.
So we're back, unfortunately, on our last segment of the show, because this has been really, really interesting. So now that we've discussed what's culture and how it affects the way we see the world, when someone who is able to speak two or more languages, how does that affect the way he makes his choices and decisions?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So that's actually what I studied for my PhD. So it took 2 years, and I found 2,000 participants. That's why it took 2 years. It takes a long time to find that many participants. And I asked that basic question, how someone's language competence affects their decision making. So for example, would a second language speaker of English make a different decision than someone who speaks English as a first language? Or if I'm in Mexico, would a first language speaker of Spanish make a different decision than someone who speaks Spanish as a second language? That's the basic fundamental question I asked. And the first part of the answer I'll give is I really like, and I also like the second part. The first part is, in many cases, there's no difference. And the reason why is because I think we're human. We have human brains. We don't have bird brains. We have human brains. So why would you speak Spanish as a first language and I speak English as a first language, why would we process the world that differently to make a decision that's different? And I would say that's like 90% of the time. But there are certain moments where decisions can change, I believe, as a result of your second language. And every time I did any test, I had more than 200 people. And the reason I had so many is because I wanted to make sure there was enough statistical power in my analyses to say, oh, there is actually a difference there, because many times these studies have 10 people or 15 or even 30 or 40, but that's a pretty small number. So I'll give one example at least. So the word in English probable, in Spanish probable, if you say it's probably going to rain tomorrow, and I say, well, okay, well, give me a number. And you say, 60% or 65%, and she says 75%. Well, that's interesting because these words embody numbers. And then that's what I did for my research. I just asked people these sentences with probable, rare, unlikely, these kind of words. And what I found is that second language speakers give higher numbers than first language speakers, give higher numbers than first language speakers. And that was fascinating. And I said, why would that be? And how are they processing the world that differently that they would give different numbers? And people would say, well, there's a mapping issue. This is very much a culture thing. Well, maybe in their language they don't have these words. Or maybe the way they use probable in Spanish is different than probable is different than probable. Those are explanations too. But I think actually the explanation is that when you're using your second language, you want to give yourselves more opportunities to be correct. And you want to give yourselves fewer opportunities to be incorrect. Because you're trying to make yourself good in a new place. So you're using language in a way that optimizes and helps you process the world and make yourself better in that new world. So that was one kind of interesting thing. There's other things about ethics that are really fascinating, about are we different ethical people when we use our second language? Are we nicer people, or are we less nice? Are we more likely to make decisions that would hurt people, or are we more likely to make decisions that would help people when we use our second language? Because some people say we're less emotional when we use our second language. So if we're less emotional, maybe we make more rational decisions, but maybe some of those rational decisions can also be not nice decisions. Those are also sort of questions. And the final one, and if anyone who's listening to this now or later, you can take out a piece of paper. This is my favorite one. So if you have a bat and you have a ball, the bat costs $1 more than the ball. So the bat and the ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So before you answer that, we can answer it later too. So you have this little thing. It's not a mathematical thing. I'll repeat it again and then I'll continue. So you have a bat, a baseball bat, and you have a ball. Together they cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So what I found really fascinating, I asked this question to first and second language speakers, and guess who did better? second language speakers. Why would second language speakers do better in a particular thing? Well, I don't think we have time right now, but what I find fascinating is what I found in this particular study. There's advantages to being a second language speaker, which I thought was the most extremely interesting thing I found in my research. And there's other research that kind of suggests sometimes there's big advantages to be a second language speaker in a first language environment because of the way you process the world. So this is how your first culture and your first perceptions transferring into your second language can give you advantages. And that's nice because oftentimes we think, oh, it must be worse to be a second language speaker, but maybe sometimes it's actually better. If we understand how it's worse and how it's better, then I think we can function in the second world we live in better. Anyway, that was a long answer to your first question.
So, what's the answer? So, altogether it costs $1.10. The banana. I'd say the ball costs 5 cents.
Okay.
Math that you don't need to use.
That's why I'm studying.
So I'll repeat it, and then I'll give the answer.
Okay.
So there's a baseball bat, and there's a ball, a baseball, and together they cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Almost everyone, first and second language speakers, give the instinctual answer, which is 10 cents. Almost everyone, period. Doesn't matter who you are in the world, right? It's just how it is. And the reason why that's very plausible, it's very logical, and it's using our system 1 thinking, which is the fast instinctive thinking. In order to solve the problem, you probably need to use your second type of thinking, which is called system 2, which is slower, more rational, more thoughtful. Well, if you're a second language speaker and you're already processing the world slower, maybe you're more ready to answer that question. So the actual correct answer is 5 cents, because if you have a bat that's $1.05 and the ball is 5 cents, that equals 1.10, and it also means that the difference between $1.05 and 5 cents is $1. Right, that's the answer. But almost everyone gives.
Yeah, like $1 straight ball.
So now you can go to your family tonight and say, una bate y una pelota junto cuestan $1.10. El bate cuesta $1 más que la pelota. ¿Cuánto cuesta la pelota? And everyone will think you're the most genius person ever.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that's something like you're kind of studying for your dissertation, right? So what's your dissertation about? Because I think they're kind of related.
Oh no. I'm so ashamed. Okay. I want to do my thesis on emotions in the second language because I do believe that when you speak a language and maybe you're angry and you want to, I don't know, my native language is Spanish, so I'm speaking English. And when I get very, very angry and I cannot show that anger in English, maybe because of my vocabulary or because I don't feel the same anger as in Spanish, I make this code switching. That's what I'm studying for, maybe. I don't know.
So there's a researcher named Alberto Costa. I think it's Alberto Costa.
Yeah.
He's in Spain.
Him. Yes.
He does a lot of that. I don't always agree with that. I think sometimes you can be, I don't think it's always less emotional in the second language, but he has lots of research that suggests exactly that.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you know something, but can you tell us something about code switching, maybe?
So go ahead.
That's a word that you hear more and more these days. But sorry, just to...
Absolutely. So code switching, for people who don't know, it's just like it sounds. You're switching from one code to the other. In the world of language, it's switching from one language to another. So you switch between English and Spanish. So a famous example is Spanglish. Oye, ¿cómo está? Vamos al mall because, I want some food. Oye, no tengo hambre. That's your problem. That's Spanglish. But the thing about code switching, it's actually very you guys probably know this, very rule-based.
No.
That you can only switch at certain points where the grammatical structure allows you to switch.
And does this have... so we are almost up on time, but a couple other things we wanted to talk about. So can we connect code switching? It seems like that would connect with cultural assimilation and some of these questions about, or how can we think about some of these other important phenomena with
I
culture
think
and language?
code switching you can be seen as a bootstrapping idea, that it's on your way to, maybe it's an interlanguage phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're learning your second language, you switch a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, while you're learning the second language, eventually become proficient enough, you don't need to code switch. You can look at it like that. There's many different ways to look at code switching, but that would be one way to look at it.
Okay, so before we go, I've got a question for all of you, including myself. So, we both speak Spanish as our first language. You speak English as your first language. So, in this cross-cultural encounter, do you have a word in Spanish that represents a concept that you cannot translate?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that word is at the moment. Desmadre, I used it earlier, so it just comes to mind because I think it captures something.
Desmadre.
Yeah, it captures something beautiful, because when I use that word, I see something very different, and when I go to the United States, I can't use the translation. It would be like mess. You know, it just doesn't work.
No, I think desmadre is stronger than desmadre.
Exactly. That's why. So it just doesn't. It has something that's so strong, and I really love the word because I can use it, and it's very clear, and I understand the world better when I use it. I understand Mexico better when I use it.
Okay, thank you very much. Nathaniel, do you have a word like that?
I'm trying to think of one. Yeah, I mean that is a good example. I guess also some of the terms like chido or padre, está chido. They have I mean you can think of maybe a bit easier to translate, but they just, I mean, I think it also has to do with vocal intonation and these sorts of things in the context and the way they're also used to punctuate. I think.
What do you mean by punctuate?
Sort of the way that they punctuate thought. You know, spoken language is sort of punctuate, but I don't know the linguistic terms, but it's sort of like these filler words that are sort of used as commas or sort of as punctuation, verbal punctuation marks,
cool.
or sort of like or like neta, things like that, right? The words that are thrown in a lot, and specifically in Mexican Spanish, so sort of they give structure to a conversation, and I sort of
cool.
understanding. Are getting used to the frequency and the ways those are used in variations.
That's sophisticated. That's hard.
Well, and that's the thing. I don't think I fully understand it, but starting to sort of get a grip on it, I think, or noticing patterns definitely helps. I don't know if does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
How about you guys with English?
With English, I really don't know. But at least in Spanish, there's a word that I always want to translate in English, and I don't know how to translate it or how to explain it, which is amargado.
Bitter?
Yeah, but you don't say to a person he's bitter. Or yes?
He's a bitter person.
Yeah, you say it.
People can be.
Oh, really? Because I tried to explain that to a friend, and he was like, what? I was like, I don't know. Yeah, but I love that word.
Okay, for me, well, in education, to address or to meet a goal and stuff like that, but for my daily life speaking, I think afford is the concept that I cannot translate, because in Mexico afford is like presupuestar, something like that, but that has to do only with money. So I can afford a car. That means that I cannot buy it, but we only use that word for money. And in English, you can use it like, I cannot afford another absence, because if I do, then they're gonna fail me.
Oh, interesting.
So I cannot say, no me puedo presupuestar otra falta, because presupuesto is just for money. So afford is a concept that I cannot translate in. I use Spanglish whenever I need to say that.
Yeah.
To afford.
That's cool. Thanks for sharing.
Okay, well, I think we are just about up at the end of this show. Another very hearty thank you to Dr. Zachary Brooks.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to, you have 3 remaining talks this week, tonight and Thursday, Friday?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And I know you guys will be in attendance. I hope many of our audience members will be as well. Thank you again. I'm your faculty host, Nathaniel.
I'm Fernanda.
And Vic.
Y Zacharias, Zachary Brooks.
our
Okay.
special guest.
Thanks for joining us on Radio Culture Shock. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.